Oh, the good old days of the early 2000s, when the internet was just starting to grow and we ate bad CGI for breakfast. Or so I would say if we weren't still eating bad CGI almost 2 decades later. The only difference is that we now give a fuck and complain about it. Although I have to say, at least before it seemed they used 3D animation more responsibly, maybe even with a defined purpose. I mean, as I remember it, when you saw 3D animation in the early days, you mostly saw it in specific situations in the show. For example, in Vandread, one of the shows we're gonna talk about today, 3D animation was reserved for the segments that contained mecha battling in outer space. In a way, this established a clear line between the traditionally animated space of character development and interaction inside the main ship and the space of clunky mecha action in, well, space. This meant that, although we were seeing this radically different type of animation, we weren't taken out of the immersion we were in because we already perceived this different animation as representing a different and specific part of the world we were immersed in. In some cases, this even helped punctuate the idea that we were in a different world or in a different context. Nowadays, in anime, it just seems to be there for no other purpose than to try to replace traditional animation. But you can't. It's just a different type of animation. I'm not trying to say that 3D animation can't look good. There certainly are instances of it being applied well in some shows, but I think that's because those studios know how to use it, and are not trying to conceal it or make it just a surrogate for traditional animation. For example, I have no issue with this CG mutated caster in Fate Zero. Of course, drawing and animating such a beast would be tough to say the least, but I even think that it wouldn't work as good if it had been done in such a way. The uncanny effect it gives when you look at it works. The contrast between the CG and the drawings makes it look ominous, as something that doesn't fit and is not supposed to be there. And that adds to our perception of it as an abomination, as a dangerous force of destruction. And that's something good in that situation. It's an added value. The point is that we're not supposed to feel that same uneasy way about a freaking protagonist, but the worst, I think, is that sometimes it's even used needlessly. Like, why? Why do you have to animate these people here? What purpose do they have? This could be an empty street and no one would have cared. No one would have complained that there are not enough pedestrians in this random street. That's not the point of the show, right? Are you trying to appear closer to reality by having random people walking in the streets? Who cares? Have you ever heard of suspension of disbelief? But no, you have to animate these people and fucking take me away from the immersion with their clunky ass 3D movement. I just can't avoid but notice these things. And the worst part is that they are useless. Are you doing this to bother people? I swear to fucking God. Okay, I'm sorry about that. We're not here today to talk about that, but to focus on the topic of gender performativity. First of all, let me get something out of the way. Gender studies is a relatively new field of academic studies, and in no way, I'm trying to say I'm an expert in the field. I'm just gonna work with a specific concept this academic has developed, and I'm gonna try to explain it before applying it to the shows. In other words, we're not gonna go too deep in the field of gender studies, and again, I don't think I could even if I intended to. Also, don't think that I'm trying to say these two shows subscribe to the vein of gender studies. They are pretty ingrained in the heterosexual culture they were conceived in. I mean, this one even tried to make a freaking blob feminine. Jesus, I can't imagine what kind of fetishes it was supposed to appeal to. But anyway, they have interesting ideas that I consider we could approach better from the perspective of gender performativity. Imagine me as a scavenger watching a train wreck that, after the crash, approaches the wreck to scavenge the strongest nuts and bolts that held firmly in their place until the very end. Now, before we begin, let's talk a bit about the space operas we're gonna analyze. Yeah, you heard that right, but you never thought of this anime with such a classy name. So, why did I choose to analyze these two anime? Well, there is the obvious similarity of both being space operas, but there is also a relevance in some of the themes they dwell in. Maybe this is more apparent in Vandread considering the topic of relations between men and women is developed primarily throughout the show, but Sidonia no Kishi also expresses some interesting points and ideas we'll get into later. Finally, of course, I like him. Kinda. I mean, I really liked Vandread, but on the other side, maybe I watched Sidonia no Kishi on pure inertia. So maybe it evens up? I don't know. I'm saying this because, you know, there are more obvious anime I could have used to talk about the topic of gender performativity. You yourself may be thinking of a couple right now. And although it could be easier to talk about gender performativity in anime that explicitly tries to deal with the topic, as I've said, there are reasons I chose these ones, and hopefully they will become apparent by the end of the video. This is not me just trying to assert my dominance by intentionally pressing myself on a harder task or anything like that. So, what is gender performativity? Let's break it down because this is gonna be a pretty tough one to explain. First, let's try to understand the concept of gender here. So, gender can basically be understood as the way cultures regulate and produce the categories of masculine and feminine, which themselves are constituted by a number of characteristics bound to a specific body. That sounds simple enough, but inside gender studies, more specifically the work of Judith Butler, we begin to understand the complexity behind this perception of gender. You see, by considering gender a cultural product, most people would then try to establish a pre-cultural state of the body, and would appeal to sex as some kind of pure category of the human being. But, as Butler would argue, this distinction between sex and gender is problematic, since we do not relate to the body without gender signifiers. There is no purity in the sex we suppose as pre-cultural, because we use gender signifiers to relate to the body since birth. What this is trying to show us is that the sex, this being the male or female genitalia, is already charged with gender signifiers. Since the moment the "is it a boy or a girl" question is answered, people start relating to the body from a gender perspective. The blue or pink attire, the toys, the "what will they be when they are older" indicates how painfully aware we are, or maybe subconsciously aware, that the sex is the gender. Like the two sides of a piece of paper. When we see one side, we're practically seeing the other. To quote Butler on this, there are other types of differences between people. Differences in form and size, in the formation of the earlobe and the size of the nose, but when a baby comes into the world, we don't ask what kind of earlobe he has. We immediately ask for determined anatomic traits because we know that these traits, in a way, will determine the social destiny of the baby. Because of that, by differentiating the babies in the way we do, we establish heterosexuality as a preconception of human identity, and propose a constrictive norm disguising it as a natural fact. We have to understand that she is not trying to say that we don't have the biological traits of penis or vagina, but that the way we understand and relate to these traits is socially constructed and not purely biological. Society doesn't see the penis or the vagina as mere reproductive tools, but as a way to determine and build gender subjects and to try to adhere us to a norm, thus making gender a thing. Now, with a better understanding of the word gender, let's focus on performativity. You may already be making a connection with the concept of performance, and you wouldn't be wrong to do so, but bear with me for a second. When we talk about performativity, we need to have in mind a more refined meaning of the performance. You see, when we talk about art, a performance is different from just acting. That's because in theater, acting is bound to a text, to the script. The actor is bound to the play and he needs to act accordingly. Of course, good actors can innovate and go off script, but those are exceptions to the rule. In theater, the gestures, the expressions, they all matter, but the discourse is the one that commands the play. On the other side, in the performance, the text stops being the center, and the nucleus becomes the actor, the body, and what the body can do. Here, the heart of the performance becomes improvisation. In this sense, the performance is constituted by a freedom of expression with the body. But this freedom comes with a bit of danger. You see, when we go to the theater, we are watching a play and the protagonist stabs himself with a knife and maybe even fake blood starts pouring out. We know it's an act. We know it's not real and that he's just representing the actions of a specific character in the play. This is not true for the performance, however. When someone performs, he's not representing a character or following a script. Everything that happens to the performer is real. That's why we mostly see performances with an active socio-political purpose. As you can see, to perform is way different from just acting. In the performance, you're putting your body on the line to generate an impact, and that mostly happens when you challenge or undo the norms. Gender performativity means that there is no essence in gender beyond the mere repetition of the norm, and this repetition, this performance of the norm, allows us to see how arbitrary it is, and how the norm can change if we perform it differently. This shows us that the norm is not as rigid as society tries to make it seem, and that can be exemplified with how it has changed throughout history. For example, in ancient Greece, the essence of women was in affection, the warmth, not in rationality. It was a very strict distinction that didn't allow women to be seen as rationally capable, and on a pragmatic level, that of course has changed. Women can now be physicists, mathematicians, philosophers, presidents, etc. And that doesn't mean they don't have affection or warmth anymore, but that they are not secluded and limited to that essence they were limited to in ancient Greece. Also, in that same time period, homosexual love was not something out of the ordinary. Men could love and have sexual relationships with other men without it getting in the way of having families. Some philosophers even argued that true love could only be achieved between equals. And in those male-dominated times, the only true equality was between men, and we don't have to go back that far in time. Just 200 years ago, it was perfectly normal for women to have body hair and for men to wear high heels. Even women wearing pants now is something relatively new. The point is, things have changed, and because gender norms have changed throughout history, their essence is, at the very least, put in doubt. Because that means that they can change and most likely will in the future. And this is because we perform our gender in everything we do. And when we perform mannerisms, gestures and activities that don't follow the strict gender norms, we show a natural resistance to it. We show a natural resistance to the fictional male or female ideal constantly proving it wrong. For example, maybe you're a guy that likes to watch girly shows, or a girl that likes to practice manly sports. And whenever you do that, you are not just resisting gender norms, but you are also consolidating and actively reconstructing gender. The fact that gender is performative allows us to approach it from an infinite number of ways, showing us that it's not a neat binary between men and women. Without going into sexual preferences, we can have men that like girly stuff and women that like manly stuff, to put it one way. Maybe some like to act more womanly and others more manly. Some may look masculine and have feminine interests. Some may look feminine and have masculine interests. There is such an infinite array of possibilities that Butler begs the question, should the categories of boys and girls, but more importantly, the gender norms attached to each category even exist? Now that was complicated. If it wasn't too clear for you, hopefully we can clear it up when we apply it to today's study object, Vandread. I gotta say I really like this show. From the outside, it may look like your typical ecchi harem anime with a sci-fi twist, but honestly, there isn't that much fan service in the show. And whatever there is, it's pretty tame considering the things we have experienced recently. Also, in spite of the premise this being 3 men stuck in a spaceship full of women, it is not really a harem show. I mean, at best there are 2 women romantically interested in the protagonist. Everyone else has their own interests and motivations, so one could say this show is pretty deceptive in its presentation. And, as we'll see in a bit, also pretty deceptive in the way it develops the subject at hand. On a surface level, I don't think Vandread is trying to make a point on how men and women are incomplete if they are apart. I mean, in this sci-fi future, we can see how men and women have no problem living apart. They can generate societies and are perfectly fine striving by themselves. But the point, I think, is that how, even if they are fine just by themselves, they can be better together. And Vandread chooses to show this by approaching the issue in a different manner. We have a planet inhabited just by men and another inhabited just by women. Each one has its own set of customs and traditions, and what Vandread does is get some people from each planet and put them inside the subtly named Nirvana. Hilarity ensues. But it's because of its own mythos, its own way of approaching things, that Vandread can't avoid but make commentary on the gender stereotypes that constitute us. This is one of the reasons I chose this show to talk about gender performativity. Even though most likely it's not on purpose, the show still manages to defy gender norms. I mean, there are some obvious points the show consciously tries to make about homosexual relationships. You can easily draw a parallel in how Mayor and Taraka authorities react in outrage to the possibility of heterosexual relationships, and the way some of our modern-day authorities react in outrage to homosexual relationships. But gender is not just about that. If anything, your sexual interests are just a part of it. As we've discussed before, your gender is constituted by a multitude of actions, gestures and mannerisms you actively enact. And Even if Vandread most likely is not concerned with gender performativity, the way it defies gender norms can help us understand how gender performativity works. First of all, there are functional societies of only men and only women. What this shows us, for example, is that even in a world where the only sex is female, everyone performs their supposed gender differently. The only real classification they have remotely related to gender is the Fama and the Oma, which actually refers to the one that donates the embryo and the one that has the baby in a couple. One could argue that the Oma seems to be more masculine and related to a traditional father figure, but in the show, they don't seem to give a shit about that. Like I said, the show is pretty ingrained in heterosexual culture, so this traditional depiction of family is most likely a way to avoid alienating the viewers. I mean, we also see a potential Oma that doesn't adhere to a traditional masculine stereotype, so it's obvious they don't really give a fuck about that. Society tries to attach the narrative of gender to our anatomy, when there are plenty of people that don't fit into that categorization. Vandread seems to notice this because it's women perform in many different ways, and so it begs the question, what is a real woman in Vandread? Well, there is none. In Mayor, it seems that the only purpose for their classification as women is to have a contrast to the men of Tarak. And as Dita constantly reminds us, this is more resembling of what we would call a yeah, we get it. So, in Mayor, society seems to consider the definition of the word woman in relation to what we would consider a human or an earthling. Apart from that, we only have the difference between the Fama and the Oma, which as we've talked about before, doesn't really mean that much. In conclusion, the people of Mayor don't seem to care about any restrictive gender categories, and if you are drawing a parallel with Earth, we shouldn't either. Let's see the other side. We don't really get as much details on Tarak's society as we do with Mayor's, but from what we can glance, it pretty much is what you would expect from a traditional depiction of masculinity. A heavy industrialized military society with its inhabitants appearing as manly as they can be, never mind that they have kids and form families together. I guess this being a shonen anime meant that it couldn't be too ballsy in its depiction of masculinity. Oh, how fragile is our identity. But we do have a man we can explore deeper. It's not the sneaky looking Bart, although it looks like he enjoyed dressing as a woman, or the serious looking Duelo, although his whole identity doesn't seem to be that of a man but that of a...
心配するな。私は医者だ。気にすることはない。私も医者としての立場で君の治療をするんだ。私は医者だ。もはや妊娠についての学習は終えたつもりだ。
I'm obviously referring to our protagonist, Hibiki Tokai. From the start, we see in Hibiki a guy troubled with his masculine identity. He goes to the extent of trying to steal a vanguard and gets himself involved in a lot of trouble because he wants to uphold his vision of masculinity. Even after that, he struggles to maintain his identity in front of the people around him, and his personality comes out as forced at best, because he should act like a man, right? But this idea later comes to literally kick his ass in the form of Rabat. You have strong symbolism when the epitome of masculinity in the show, strong, tall, good with women, you know what I mean, comes and starts beating the living shit out of you, telling you how much you aren't a real man. I say the epitome of masculinity, but it seems that Hibiki himself can't see Rabat as his male ideal, which only goes to show how twisted and forced his perception is. Hibiki was already struggling to adhere to his idealized masculine identity, and this event right here just tells him stop. The find your own words struggle is a good metaphor for someone adhering to someone else's rules, in this case, gender norms. Hibiki eventually does find himself, and what does he realize?
あんたの言葉があったから俺は今日まで生き延びることができた。情けねえ話だが俺は俺の証なんて立てられなかった。だけど勢いだけのろくでなしだった俺にあんたが考えるきっかけをくれたんだ。ありがとよ。
私が保証しよう。今までのすべてが響都会の証だ。
You know, I'm not giving Vandread nearly as much credit as I should be. Maybe I'm just being skeptic to the idea of an old shonen fully embodying what I'm trying to explain with gender performativity, but then I see how the ideal image of a man is challenged with a shonen protagonist shorter than other women, with a more immature and borderline tsundere attitude, and holy shit, is that inverse path walking? What year is this, 2000? This shit was visionary. But wait, am I missing something? What is that?
タラーク帝国特務諜報部裏霞天命階級中佐認証暗号カノエ2038認証開始
It's a trap!
Now this some OG trap right here, getting Bart all riled up and then dropping the T-bomb, damn. But he don't give a fuck about that. My boy's all up for that shit. BC even chooses to stay like that even after being revealed as a trap. Oh shit, is that a transgender statement right there, Vandread? Damn! Now that we're here, I would like to talk a bit on the subject of traps. Taking into account their popularization in the last year, I would like to analyze one important question that has been raised with it, one that still stirs some debate to this very moment. Are traps gay? Of course, we are not trying to find out if the traps in question are interested in men or women. That itself can vary from character to character. I mean, they can dress as a woman but still be sexually attracted to women. We also don't care if the men inside those stories are interested in the traps. Most likely, as the name implies, they don't know that the character is a trap. And what about the women that are sexually interested in them? None of that matters really, for the question, are traps gay, obviously refers to you, the average trap consumer. I mean, the consumer of the media where the traps are depicted. So, are you gay for liking traps? Well, it isn't actually that simple. You see, there is a paradox with the name trap, because the character is really just a trap for the other characters in the story. Most likely, if you like traps, you already know the nature of the character before you approach the content when they're at. So you're not just being deceived thinking you're seeing a woman. Maybe for some trap aficionados it's the surprise that they like. Maybe they like not knowing that someone is a trap until a big reveal happens. Maybe some like how the character looks and go by the lines of the dick just makes it better. Others may just be attracted to the exterior, to the fact that they look like a woman and don't really care about what's between their legs. Some of them may actively ignore the fact that they are traps and imagine that they are just women. Some may even like traps just because they find the culture around them funny. I mean, there are so many different ways to approach and appreciate traps that saying that those who like traps are gay is at the very least an oversimplification. So, to the actual question, are traps gay, in which we don't refer to the traps themselves, but to the actual people that like to consume traps, I have to say that traps are not straight. This may seem like a cop-out, but we can't actually say that liking traps is straight. If you're a guy, the fact that you have an attraction for characters that don't follow the established female gender norms of, being a woman, even if it's not flat out gay, still doesn't fit the ideal of what a straight male should be. And if you're a girl, you can't just say that it's a dude and be okay with it, because you'd still be attracted to the feminine image of the trap. So yeah, if you like traps, whether you're a boy or a girl, you are in some way defying the gender norms that society tries to impose on us. Keep up the good work. Okay, so that was kind of a long segue, but I also wanted to talk about that as an intro to the character we are about to analyze. If you were waiting all this time for the and Sidonia no Kishi part of the video, I'm gonna have to apologize, but you may be a bit disappointed, because I'm not really gonna talk too much about the show. I mean, I think I liked it. Maybe it's complicated. I guess I find interesting the implications of humanity fully industrializing itself for the sake of survival, but we are not here to talk about that. Instead, we're going to focus on this specific character.
Shinatose Izana だよ。よろしく。
Is he a trap for looking like a girl but not being one? Is she an inverse trap for saying that she isn't a girl and then kinda becoming one? Who cares? If I have something good to say about Sidonia no Kishi, is that it follows through with the big concepts it conceives. I mean, the show is not just content with establishing its futuristic sci-fi scenario, but it tries, most of the time, to develop those ideas to their ultimate rational consequences. And one of those ideas is represented by Izana right here. So, one of the consequences of the industrialization of mankind is that they now need to use clones to increase the population. And some of these clones are, as Izana describes it,
男か女か
いや
どっちでもないよ。地下が長いと知らないだろうけど、最近は男女以外の性もいるんだよ。受胎のための相手は男でも女でも構わない。相手を選ぶとそれに合わせて体が変化していくんだ。
This really blew my mind the first time I saw it. I mean, this concept is a middle finger to the perception of gender as a pure category we talked about in the beginning. It reverses the idea, putting your sex as a consequence of you and not as a cause. I mean, she kinda embodies what gender performativity looks for. The freedom to perform yourself as you desire, without needing to adhere to strict gender norms. Also, the idea that your sex defines you gets thrown out the window, as Izana can get the desired attributes to suit a specific interest for Nagate, or your specific interest. Jesus, what am I looking for? I guess Izana still acts like your stereotypical girl most of the time, but well, we have to assume that's what Izana is and that she is not trying to follow a specific gender norm. It would definitely be more interesting to see Izana perform in a less traditional way, but you know, nothing is perfect, including gender. Well then, let's try to get a clear conclusion from this overly complicated topic. First of all, I'd like to reiterate the idea that when we talk about gender performativity, we're focusing on social conduct. When talking about gender, people seem to only notice the sexual conduct of the individual. And of course, your sexual interests can take a part in gender performativity, as those can also defy gender norms, but I don't want to solely focus the discussion on that. If anything, with this analysis that I've brought you today, I would like to have shown that gender is a lot more complicated than we like to think, and that we shouldn't try to escape from the complications that constitute this topic. You see, if there is an objective, a goal that gender performativity tries to achieve, it's to deconstruct gender, and hopefully become its undoing. But with all the new categories we try to use to represent our dissident identities, gender theory just seems to have caused a proliferation of gender. I get the human need to categorize and have something to identify yourself with, but this seems to be detrimental to the cause. Or maybe it is a needed step to make gender collapse in itself with this overcategorization. I don't know. Look, I'm not trying to say that you should feel bad or insecure if you are someone who adheres to established gender norms. I have to say that I'm pretty compliant to them myself. But that goes both ways. No one should be ostracized for not being able to fit into the restrictive categories the narrative of gender tries to adhere to our anatomy, and no one should force themselves to fit into them either. We are free to express and perform what we are, and we can do this by realizing that the norms that we follow are just as powerful as we ourselves make them to be. Whew, that was even longer than I imagined it would be. Maybe I should have just stick with Vandread. Well, whatever. Thanks for watching, really. Hopefully it wasn't too much of an ordeal to get through the video, and I also hope you leave with more knowledge than when you started watching. It's all about a discussion, so if you agree, disagree, or have anything to add, go ahead and comment below. If you liked what you saw, I would really appreciate it if you shared the video to help the channel grow. Also, if you like the academic approach, watch the previous video I made about Fate Zero and moral genealogy. Follow me on Twitter @BehindBigLeaf if you wanna stay in touch. And thanks again for watching. See ya!